great pleasure and a great honor to be here in Dubai to talk to you at this very distinguished conference, which I'm glad to see is becoming bigger and more successful every year. I think this is a very, very important event. It's almost the only place in the world where people who work for government can come together away from their jobs, away from policy making for a few hours and think about the nature of what they're really doing and the purpose of government. And that's what I want to talk to you about this morning during my session. Now, I have about an hour. I promise I'm not going to talk for an hour because that would be unbearable. I'm going to talk for about 40 or 45 minutes and leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. But first and foremost, what I'd like to do is to tell you the story of the Good Country Index and how I got to it. Because in some ways, it's quite an interesting story. It's a parable, if you like, about the things that we measure and the things that we learn from the things that we measure. So going right back to the beginning, in the late 1990s, I'm sometimes accused of being the man who invented the term nation branding. I've spent a lot of the last 15 years running away from that term because I don't like it very much. But it's a term that many of you will have heard, nation branding, the idea that countries have images, and those images need to be good and positive. And when I coined that term back in 1998, it was still considered to be rather a radical idea. The idea that it wasn't just the reality of a country that mattered, it was also the way that the rest of the world perceived that country. And what I was able to show with some research that I did over the years was that the image of a country had a profound effect on that country's performance, on its competitive performance. Because in the 1990s, competitiveness was what I was mostly interested in. And I discovered that countries that had good, positive, powerful images found everything was easier. It was easier for them to get tourists because they had a good image. It was easier for them to get investment because they had a good image. In short, countries with good images had to spend far less money on promoting themselves because people already believed that they were good. Good tourist destinations, good investment destinations, good partners for trade and diplomacy and culture and society and all the rest of it. Now, that probably sounds very obvious to you today in 2015. But when I first started saying these things back in 1996 or so, people thought it was rather shocking. And a lot of politicians, a lot of ministers said to me at the time, we don't care about image. Image is superficial. That's not our jobs. Our job is about reality, real policies that have real impacts on people. But my answer was always the same. The last time I checked, we're all human beings, and we can only experience the world through perception. And perception is everything. And paradoxically, I argued, when the world is so big and so connected, the image is actually more important than the reality, for the simple reason that most people don't know the reality. In 2005, I started a big research project called the Nation Brands Index, because I wanted to measure what ordinary people around the world thought about countries. I wanted to try to measure the images of countries. And the first thing I discovered was that most people don't think about other countries at all. This was rather a surprising discovery because I personally think about other countries a lot. It's my favorite subject. But most people in the world are not very cosmopolitan. In fact, what I discovered is that most people only ever think about 3 countries. They think about their own country a little bit, not very much. They tend to think about the United States of America, because it's sort of there and you can't avoid it. And they think about a third country, which varies depending on who you ask. So it might be the Maldives, because that's where they want to go on holiday. It might be Dubai, because that's where they want to go and retire. That's it, 3 countries. And the last time I checked, there were 205 countries in the United Nations system, which basically means that to all intents and purposes, 202 countries effectively, for the majority of the world's population, do not exist. People just never think about them. And so when governments were coming to me and saying, we want to improve our image, we want to raise our profile, I found I had to inject a dose of objective reality into the conversation. Because for me, the biggest challenge was making anybody even recognize their existence. It's a very, very hard thing to do. Anyway, that was the beginning of the journey. And I decided, as I mentioned, that I wanted to start measuring the images of countries because it seems to me that we all have opinions about which countries have good images and which countries have bad images. But those are just our personal opinions, and they don't necessarily correspond to the opinions of the 7 billion people out there. So starting in 2005, we interviewed 1,000 people in each of 28 countries, and we asked them a long list of questions, 50 questions, about 50 countries, saying, what do you think about the landscape in this country? Do you think it's beautiful? What do you think about the economy? Is it growing? Is it thriving? What do you think about the people? Are they nice? Are they nasty? Are they hardworking? Are they lazy? Are they rude? Are they polite? Would you like to be friends with somebody from this country? Would you like to hire somebody from this country? And I'd ask about the culture. Do you think this country has a strong cultural heritage? Do you think it has modern popular culture that people could enjoy participating in? And we'd ask about the products. Would you buy a product from this country? Would you buy a technology product? Or would you buy an agricultural product or a fashion product? And so across this very broad questionnaire, and a very large number of people every year, we began to be able to construct a profile, a map, of how countries were generally perceived. And it was very interesting. And I started doing it every 3 months because I wanted to see how quickly the images of countries changed. And the first thing I discovered after doing this survey 3 times was that I'd created the world's most boring survey, because basically it never changed. And after 2 years of doing the survey every 3 months and discovering that people never changed their minds about countries, I started doing it every year. I thought there's no point. And I discovered that even year on year, most people never changed their minds about countries. And I began to realize that what we were dealing with here, when we're talking about national reputation, is not really a liquid currency that can be bought and spent and increased, but a fixed capital, an asset, that your country either has or it hasn't. And that was rather depressing for a lot of the governments I was advising, because they wanted to change it. They knew how important a good image was, and they wanted to improve it. And a lot of them were spending a lot of money on trying to improve it, and secretly wondering why it wasn't really working. Lots and lots of governments were spending millions and millions of dollars of their taxpayers' money on advertising campaigns and public relations campaigns and logos and slogans, telling everybody how fantastic their country was. And they were astonished to discover that it didn't seem to make any difference. Everybody was just ignoring those messages. Now, partly, it was obvious to me that they were just doing very bad marketing. Bad marketing is very simple to describe. What you do is you take a product that you want people to buy, like a bottle of water, and you buy some media, some advertising space, and you say to people over and over again, this is good water, this is good water, this is good water. It's not very sophisticated. And when you've got a very sophisticated audience and very sophisticated competitors, it doesn't really work. Good marketing, sophisticated marketing, is the kind where you start with the consumer. And I look at you and I examine you very carefully and I interview you and I find out, what is your life like? What are you missing from your life? What is it that you would like to have that you don't have? What would you like to learn that I could teach you? What would you like to use that I could make for you? What would you like to buy that I could sell to you? And when you've begun to understand then what the need of the marketplace is, then you can find a message, a product, that means something to those people. But none of the governments were doing it. It's quite amusing. If you have a look at most of the nation branding or city branding campaigns that go on today, and they still go on, and there are more and more of them every year, you'll find that that's what they all do. What they do is they just endlessly repeat how wonderful they are, And you know what? People don't care. You see, everybody out there, by definition, has a perfectly good country of their own, and they're not in the market for a new one. And so if they read in the newspaper that the UAE is the best country on earth, they're probably going to ignore it because they don't live there. They're probably going to say, well, lucky you, you must be very proud. And actually, if they live in a country which is less happy, less successful, less prosperous, less tolerant than the UAE, they might even be rather annoyed by these messages. Because they'll say to themselves, I know that the country I live in is not as prosperous, tolerant, equal, happy as the UAE. Why are you rubbing it in? So this kind of work just doesn't work, and I've spent a lot of the last 15 or 20 years basically trying to undo the damage that I did with this term nation branding and saying to people, it's not branding, it's not advertising, it's not marketing. And after many, many years of saying this message to many, many governments, eventually somebody turned around and said, okay, so what is it? And this question took me entirely by surprise. I'm ashamed to admit that I didn't have an answer. And I began thinking about it. I thought, well, why do people admire one country more than another? What is it, really and truly? Is it because that country is more powerful? Is it because it's richer? Is it because of something to do with its history? And the fact was, I simply didn't know. But what I did have was an enormous amount of data. The Nation Brands Index, because it collects so much data every year, and because I'd been doing it for such a long time, had accumulated a gigantic database. I think it's the third or fourth largest social survey that's ever been conducted in any field of the social sciences. At the moment, the last time I conducted the Nation Brands Index, which was in 2014, the accumulated database was equal to 240 billion data points. Now, that's a lot of data. And I never really had much of an opportunity to examine that data closely and to ask simple questions about it. So in 2011, I decided I was going to take a year off and stop advising governments for a year or 2 years, or however long it took, until I could actually answer that question. What does make our image better? What can we do to improve it? Because we know it's important. And I spent that year, it ended up being 2 years, examining very, very closely those 240 billion data points. Now, I should admit right away that I'm a very, very poor statistician. I don't remember my times tables. And I melted 3 computers during the course of that year trying to understand what the database was telling me. And I was only asking it one simple question. Why do people admire country A more than country B? Eventually, with a little bit of help from some people who do understand statistics, a model came out. And it was I called it the Mars model, M-A-R-S-S. I'm not going to spend too long explaining this to you, but just very briefly. Those 5 components, M-A-R-S-S, are basically the 5 reasons why people admire country A more than country B. M stands for morality. Morality means, I think it's a good country. I think it's a country that contributes something to humanity, to the world that I live in. Yeah? So even if I live in Uruguay and I'm thinking about the United Arab Emirates, if I think the UAE is a good country, what that means is I'm glad the UAE exists. It doesn't just benefit its own people, it benefits somehow the world in which I and my friends in Uruguay live. That's the first one, morality. The A of the model is aesthetics, beauty. Physically, what does it look like? This is very important for human beings. If we're sighted, we tend to interpret everything through our visual sense before any other sense. And our perception of whether a country is beautiful or ugly is very significant because we're prejudiced, we human beings. We respond positively to beauty and we shy away from what we consider to be ugliness. And everybody has an idea in their head of whether a country looks nice or doesn't look nice. So aesthetics is a very important component, it turns out. Now, that component may be communicated by tourism promotion. So tourism promotion is sometimes very valuable. If you have a very beautiful country, tourism advertising is a very good way of showing it to the rest of the world. And people will see the pictures of your beautiful country and they'll think, it's lovely. And they will immediately, automatically start making other associations in their mind. If it's beautiful, then maybe the people are beautiful. And if the people are beautiful, maybe they're good. We're very simple the way that we see these things. In fact, often when I'm talking about wide-scale public opinion in this way, people sometimes say to me, when you talk about public opinion, Simon, it sounds as if you're talking about a 7-year-old. And you know what? I actually am talking about a 7-year-old. I've done an experiment on this. I won't bore you with the details, but several years ago I did an experiment to try to find out what was the mental age of the world's population. And I discovered, on average, it's about 7. Individually, of course, we're all very clever and very mature. Collectively, we have a mental age of about 7. This is one of the reasons why the job of government is so difficult, because the people who end up being politicians and administrators are normally, not always, but normally much cleverer and much more mature than the average. But in order to be a good politician and a good administrator, you also need to know how to think like a 7-year-old. And most of us have forgotten that long ago. But the world's population thinks like a 7-year-old. The third element, the R, is for relevance. In the end, what's really important is whether another country is relevant to my life or not. So if I'm standing here in the United Arab Emirates and I'm thinking about Uruguay, I may think it's beautiful, I may think it's morally powerful, I may think it's a good country, but in the end, it's probably not very relevant to me. I probably think to myself, whatever happens in Uruguay is probably not going to affect my life in any very real way. On the other hand, a country like China, or Russia, or America, or Saudi Arabia, those countries are relevant because what they do may have an impact on my life, and that's highly significant. You can't change that. It's just a fact. It's about geopolitics. It's about culture. It's about economics, macroeconomics. And then there are 2 S's at the end of the Mars model. The first S is sophistication. What people are asking themselves when they think about other countries is it a modern, sophisticated country with technology? Or is it an old-fashioned, primitive country where they're still ploughing the fields with oxen? And everybody has in their minds a very clear idea about whether countries are modern and technologically sophisticated or whether they're old-fashioned and medieval. And generally speaking, we like the countries that are modern because we interpret that as being a mark of their intelligence, their successfulness. And that's partly why we admire them. And then the last S is strength. To some degree, we are also influenced, not always positively, but we are influenced by how strong we perceive each country to be. This is what Professor Joseph Nye of Harvard University calls hard power. Does the country have a big army, a big economy, a big territory, a big population? Does it have the power to impose its will on other countries? Or is it weak? Uruguay, I suspect, is weak. I don't know anything about it. I don't think that it's a strong country. So those are basically, it turns out, the 5 drivers of national reputation: morality, aesthetics, relevance, sophistication, and strength. And in some combination, those are the things that fundamentally determine whether people admire your country or not. And to remind you, forgive me if I repeat myself, but the reason why it's important to be reminded is because your progress and your prosperity as a country depends to an enormous extent on your image. So you can begin to see the argument forming, the equation for national success. If you do something, whatever that is, that gets you a good reputation, then you will prosper. If you don't do that thing, you will not get a good reputation, and you will not prosper, because that's the way the world works today. We're all connected. There is one marketplace. Your reputation internationally is the primary driver of your success, eventually. The next thing I did was, having developed this Mars model, I wanted to see which of these was the most important one, because when I went to governments and I said to the president or the prime minister, here you are, 5 conditions, Those are what will determine your image. The president or the prime minister would always say to me, which one should we focus on? We can't focus on 5. Which one? Should we try to be more beautiful? Should we try to be more strong? Should we try to be more modern? So I went back to the database and I did something called driver analysis, which finds out which of 5 conditions is the most significant one in producing the overall final effect. And to my astonishment, by an enormously wide margin, the winner was morality, the first one. In other words, the perception that a country is good or bad is by a very wide margin the most significant driver of its image. I was so happy when I discovered this result because it's exactly what I'd been telling governments for the previous 15 years. So it vindicated my approach, but a lot of people were skeptical. And when I first published these results, a lot of people just said, you're sentimental. You just made the result be morality because that's your worldview. You wanted the results to be like that it turns out the goodest country is the most successful one. So I checked and I checked and I checked. And I even went back to the university where I sometimes work, not very hard, and I said to them, please, could you check my numbers really quickly because I've already released them. 6 months later, they came back to me and they said, we've checked your numbers. That was really quick for a university. And I said, and? And they said, it was the worst piece of statistical analysis we have ever seen in any of our professional careers. And I said, okay. And so they said, we had to do the whole thing all over again from the beginning. And I said, okay, sorry about that. And they said, we produced exactly the same result by a completely different method. So that was rather good news because it meant that 2 entirely different methods pointed to the same result. They were also astonished and they discovered the same thing. People prefer good countries. Now, what on earth do I mean by good? It's such a strange, bland word. It's one of the first words we learn in our own language when we're a baby. That was a good thing to do. You're a bad baby. You're a good baby. What does it mean? And of course, when I'm talking to people around the world, it means very different things, depending on their age, depending on their culture, depending on their personality. When I ask an angry 17-year-old man in Kabul what he thinks is a good country, his choices are going to be very different from the choices given to me by a 72-year-old widow in Vancouver. But still, when I explore deeper, I find that they're still basically talking about the same things. Good is the opposite of selfish. In other words, no matter what your particular moral priorities are, a good country is a country that thinks beyond its own borders. It's a country that is concerned about global issues. It's a country that cares about climate change. It's a country that cares about poverty or inequality. It's a country that tries to stop wars rather than starting them. It's a country that tries to tackle the narcotics trade instead of permitting it to continue. And so on and so on and so on. You can easily see what they mean. We all know what a good country is. No matter how different our cultures are, we all agree on those things. There is a single global community which is ever more closely intertwined. And if you do something to hurt that community or obstruct the progress of that community, you're a bad country. And if you work to help that community, you're a good country. It's as simple as that. So at this point, because I'm rather addicted to indexes, I felt a new index coming along. And I thought to myself, okay, so I know that people in their hearts prefer good countries, but are they right? The countries that they think are good, are they really good? So I started searching on the internet to try to find out which countries contributed what to the global commons, to the humanity, to the planet. And I began to realize that nobody had ever asked this question before. Or if they had, they certainly hadn't published the answers on the internet. I couldn't find the data anywhere. And I thought to myself, in one of those crazy moments that we sometimes have, it wouldn't be so difficult to do this myself. 2 years later, I discovered that I created a rather controversial new survey called the Good Country Index. Now, the way that it works is really very straightforward. It's very simple. I launched it in June of 2014 at a TED Talk in Berlin, and this was the first slide that I showed to the audience. And there were gasps all around the room because Ireland came out on top, which was not what people were expecting. But you can see, I think, straight away how the thing works. Along the top there are 7 categories, and those are the categories in which a country can contribute or not contribute to the rest of the world. Science and technology, culture, international peace and security, world order, which is about the way that the world is organized, the international agencies, the United Nations and so forth, planet and climate, which is very simple and self-explanatory, prosperity and equality, health and well-being. So a country, for example, which becomes very wealthy domestically, but at the expense of other countries, because it steals the wealth from another country in order to make itself rich, will not rank very high in prosperity and equality. I completely exclude any domestic measurements from here. I'm just not interested in what countries do at home. Well, of course I'm interested, but I don't include it in this survey for the simple reason that that data is so easy to find anywhere else. Every single survey that has ever been produced measures countries' internal performance in one way or another. There are probably about 78,000 useless indexes out there, and every single one of them looks inwards. As I said during the TED Talk I gave in Berlin, they have minds that microscope, not minds that telescope. And so they're measuring countries, every other survey, including my own, as if they were islands, as if they were totally separate from the rest of the global system, as if each one of those was a little planet inhabiting its own private solar system, which is insane because we obviously live in the age of globalization. It's a zero-sum game. The resources of the planet are finite. Everybody, every system is connected. So the behavior of every country has, by definition, an impact on the citizens of people in other countries. So it only measures external impacts. And inside each of those categories, there are 5 data sets, mostly from the United Nations. 1 or 2 of them come from other big international organizations like the World Bank, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent, and so forth. It's very, very difficult to find good data about the whole world. It's really hard, partly because it's a lot of work to collect data about 200 countries. And really, you need a lot of resources to do it, which is one of the reasons why the United Nations has a virtual monopoly on data about other countries, because nobody else can afford to take the time to go and study 200 countries and collect reliable data. So this is a little bit unfortunate because it means that the handful of countries that are not members of the UN system can't be included in the index. I've had about 783 furious emails from people asking me why Taiwan is not included in the index, accusing me of being paid by the Chinese government to exclude Taiwan deliberately. It's not the case, nothing so dramatic. It's simply that Taiwan, not being a member of the UN system, its data is not collected. The same applies for Cuba. I have a lot of angry Americans, not Cubans, telling me that the reason I left out Cuba is because I'm a fascist. If you ever want to get a lot of hate mail, just release an index about other countries. I think on one particular day, I had 2 emails accusing me of being a Zionist and 2 emails of accusing me of being an anti-Zionist on the same day. Some people view the world through a very, very narrow prism, and everything that passes in front of them, they put through that prism, and they interpret it according to their particular fixation. Anyway, one of the things you'll notice is that with the exception of New Zealand, every single one of the countries in the top 10, there are 125 countries in the index, I'll show you some of the other ones in a moment, every single one of those apart from New Zealand is in Europe. So I got another 936 emails, mainly from Americans, accusing me of a European bias, because otherwise why else would there be only European countries at the top of the index? And I thought about this very hard, because an accusation of bias is something you should take very seriously. I didn't invent the data, the United Nations collected the data, but maybe somehow I unconsciously distorted the survey in order to produce better results for European countries, because I'm from a European country. I'm from the United Kingdom. Last time I checked, it was still a European country. And I checked and I checked and I checked, and I discovered, no, it is actually correct according to this data. The European countries are the ones that contribute most to the rest of the world, and particularly the Scandinavian, the Nordic countries, which is why Finland ranks almost equal with Ireland. Now, why is that? Well, it's because the European Union is the noblest experiment in the history of humanity. It's the only time in history that a number of sovereign states have voluntarily joined together and given up some of their precious sovereignty in order to create more prosperity, more peace, more viability for the entire region. To a degree, we're in another very good example of that here in the UAE. There are not many examples in history of countries that have voluntarily done that and given away some of their sovereignty. Nobody gives away any sovereignty to the United Nations, which is one of the reasons why the United Nations doesn't have as much power as it needs. But the European Union has done it. So in Europe, we have the habit and the history of multilateralism. We are good countries by habit. And I think it's very important to say that. So this is what it looks like in detail. If you're looking at Ireland, you can see that in science and technology, what are we measuring? We're measuring the number of international students that are welcomed in from abroad, because that's cultural mixing, that's engaging with the international community. The number of scientific and technical journals that they export, they're sharing their knowledge with the rest of the world. The number of international publications generally, so they're sharing learning and culture with the rest of the world. Nobel Prizes, well, it's a funny kind of indicator, but it helps you to understand a little bit how much they're sharing their knowledge, their science, their technology, their gifts to the world. And patents. A lot of people have pointed out to me that the patent system is itself not very fair. It's more about restricting intellectual property, but still, it's the best data I've got. If you register a lot of international patents, in theory, you are contributing discoveries, innovation to the world. I won't go through all of them because that will take longer than I've got here. But briefly, you can see the kinds of data sets that go in here. In culture, really, I wanted to have things in there like, I don't know, how many countries has your symphony orchestra visited last year? But that kind of data just isn't available. In the coming years, I hope to be able to make this much, much richer. At the moment, this is really a beta version, okay? It just uses the data that's easily available, and so it's very, very incomplete. Anybody who's upset about their country's ranking, and indeed anybody who is very pleased with their country's ranking, should pause for a few years. In a few years' time, when we've done some actual research on individual countries and what they're doing individually, it will get much better. But really and truly, the reason I released this index is not because I'm a statistician. As I said, I'm really not. And I'm not a researcher at all. The reason I did this was because I wanted to make a point. I wanted people to start thinking a little bit more productively about the world that we live in. And as I said to you, for the last 15 years, I've been advising governments on how they can make themselves more competitive through improving their image. In other words, how to make themselves more selfish. And I started getting the same experience over and over again. I'd visit another country, I'd sit down, I'd have a series of fascinating meetings with the cabinet and with the head of state and the head of government, and I'd be telling them how you can become more competitive, how you can improve your image, how you can improve your trade, your tourism, and all the rest of it. And then I'd finish, and I'd go back home. And I'd be sitting on the aeroplane on the way back home. I hate flying, so I'd be miserable, and I'd be reading the newspaper, and in the newspaper I would see things that made me even more miserable. I would see people killing each other, people starving. I would see the planet melting. We've broken the weather. And I would read all this stuff, and I would say, here am I telling all of these countries how to compete against each other, how to fight against each other, basically, in an economic way. But it's no different from what they were doing in the 18th century when they were fighting against each other for territory and for treasure. And I suddenly thought, this is ridiculous. The whole world has become globalized, but it's still organized the way it was in the 18th century, as a collection of competing, warring, squabbling nation states. And that's the problem. Because as long as countries keep squabbling and warring and fighting against each other, whether it's economically or socially or culturally or militarily, the big problems, the real problems, the shared problems of climate change, of global warming, of human trafficking, of narco-trafficking, of women's rights, all of these issues, which are global issues and are beyond the reach of any single country to solve, can only be solved by cooperation, but nations won't cooperate enough. And I began to realize an important point about the way that people and nations develop. Up to a certain point, competition is good and it's valuable. It's rocket fuel. If you're competing against your competitors, it drives you forward. But then you get to a stage where you have to start mixing more collaboration and more cooperation in with your competition. And as time moves forward and prosperity and stability increase, you have to change the mixture constantly. And you have to add more cooperation, more collaboration, less competition, less fighting, less squabbling. And we're behind the curve. Given the problems in the world today, we are way behind the curve. We should be purely and solely cooperating and collaborating. And instead, the onus is always on competition and domestic performance. That's what's wrong with the world. So I'd get out of the plane in London and I'd fold up my newspaper and I'd say to myself, you're part of the problem. You're part of the problem. If I'm going around helping all these governments to compete more effectively, I'm making all this stuff worse. I'm not making it any better. So that was why I thought I'd release the index, because I wanted to get across to people the message that actually it's not about competition anymore. It's not about domestic performance. Governments today have a new mandate, and the sooner we understand this, the better it will be for humanity. The traditional mandate of governments is a very simple one. It says, you are responsible for your own people, your own voters, your own taxpayers, and you are responsible for your own slice of territory, your own sovereign territory. Everything else is secondary. United Nations can look after that. And it's a system that's worked very well for a very long time. And indeed, that's what politicians are elected for. When we vote governments, that's what we ask them to do. We say, protect our interests, increase our GDP, look after our territory, save it from the invaders, save it from the competitors. And you treat every foreigner, every other person in the world, either as a potential enemy or a potential customer. They're either somebody that you have to eliminate or they're somebody that you have to rip off. Yeah? It's one or the other. This is pathological in the extreme. What kind of global brotherhood is it where everybody is either an enemy or a customer? They're brothers. The only technical difference is that they have to have a different passport. But they live in the same finite, closed system as we do. One planet Earth, one set of resources, one population, one species. This has got to change. So I introduced the idea of a new mandate for politicians, which I call the dual mandate. And the dual mandate is very, very simple. It means that from now onwards, every leader, political leader of a nation, of a city, of a region, of a town, of a village, every corporate leader has now got two responsibilities. They're responsible for their own people and for every single man, woman, and child on the planet, all 7 billion of them. They're responsible for their own territory and the entire surface of the Earth and the atmosphere above it, the entire terrestrial globe. That's right. So even if you're just running a tiny village somewhere in the middle of the UAE, you are personally responsible for every man, woman, and child on the planet and the entire surface of the Earth and the atmosphere above it. And for all I know, the whole solar system too. Now, when I say this to most politicians, indeed, when I say this to anybody, they say, you have now completely lost your mind. This cannot work. Politicians say, I have enough trouble trying to keep my own people happy and you want me to make the whole population of the Earth happy. I have enough trouble with 7 million people, let alone 7 billion. Well, I'm not saying to anybody that you give those groups equal priority, of course. I'm not saying you have to treat every man, woman, and the child with exactly the same sense of priority as you treat your own population. Of course you have to prioritize your own people, your own territory. That's your job. That's what you've been elected to do, and you must keep that priority in your mind. What I'm saying is you're not allowed to forget the others, and you're not allowed to do anything against them. And if you're ever faced with that dilemma, that you have to favor your own people or your own territory at the expense of everybody else or anybody else or anywhere else, then you immediately flag that up as a serious dilemma that has to be thought through more seriously than any other dilemma you face, because it's a real dilemma. I'm talking about a culture change. Culture change is not such a very ambitious thing to ask for. It's happened many, many times in the past. Look at racism. Look at sexism. 20 years ago, it was the most common thing in the world for politicians or administrators, when they were sitting together in their private offices discussing policy, for them to say things that were really quite racist or really quite sexist, demeaning to other races or to the other gender, the gender that they themselves didn't happen to be. Nowadays, in most places, that's become taboo. In fact, in a lot of countries now, you go to prison for making a sexist or a racist comment, and that's good, because it means that respect for humanity is starting to spread. That's already happened, and it hasn't completely happened, but it's happened quite quickly. And I'm suggesting that the same thing should happen to nationalism as has happened to racism and sexism. That in a very short time, I hope, it will become impossible for any politician, any manager, any leader to have any meeting about any subject, even the street lighting in a village in the middle of the UAE, without referring to the rest of the world in some way or another. And nationalism, looking inwards, using a mind that microscopes instead of a mind that telescopes, will be taboo. It will be impossible. It will cost you your job if you do it. That's the change I want to see. I think it's the change that we all need. I don't think politicians are going to do that just because I tell them to. After all, I've been telling them to do this for the last 15 years, and it works from time to time, but it hasn't completely worked. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here saying this today. The only thing that's going to make this work is if somebody who has real influence over politicians starts saying it. Sometimes on a good day, I think I have real influence over politicians, but in reality, I'm kidding myself. The only people who have real influence over politicians are their citizens, whether democratically elected or not. It's the only one that anybody really cares about. So I decided the best thing to do, if we want to see this culture change, is to do a pincer action. Me and people like me doing private diplomacy, saying these things to politicians in private, but at the same time, the people politely, in a very civilized way, reminding their politicians that they also care about being a good country. That they also, when they travel abroad, want to hold up their heads. And when they meet people, say, I'm proud to come from UAE. I'm proud to come from France or Uruguay or Greenland, because we're a good country, because we contribute something to the world. The wonderful thing, and the reason I'm so happy to be here today, is because the UAE is one of the few countries that's obviously got this message already. I'm preaching to the converted. I mentioned in a tweet the other day that this award for the good use of drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, is, for me, classic good country behavior. When I read about that, it brought tears to my eyes. I thought, that's the kind of thing I wish I'd thought of, because it's brilliant. It's taking something that is negative and dangerous and bad for humanity and saying, where's the good in it? Can we find the good in it? And encouraging and stimulating and using the power of the state to find the good and to encourage it and to bring it forward. So I congratulate you on that. This is the kind of thing we need to see. That is a classic good country gesture. Starting this year, I hope I'm going to be able to launch the Good Country Summit in Copenhagen, which is where I'm starting to base my operations. And when we have the Good Country Summit, what I want to be doing is to be rewarding the governments that come up with these great ideas. that are humanity-friendly and planet-friendly. But in the end, even if a government doesn't particularly care about whether the world likes them or not, they have to remember the place that I started from, which is if they care about prosperity and they care about growth and they care about investment and they care about tourism and they care about cultural and political and diplomatic relations, the only way that they can improve that is by improving their image. And the only way that they can improve their image is by being good. So whichever way you come at this subject, you end up in the same place. So it's a pretty simple message. Doing good and doing well are completely and totally inextricable. This is the new kind of governance for the 21st century. We have to think not just of ourselves as administrators, but of caretakers of humanity. That's our job. That's what people have elected us to do. And we always have to be thinking about how we can benefit 7 billion, not just 7 million. And that's all I want to tell you. If you can remember even 30 seconds of that, it'll be good. Thank you very much.